They didn't leave. They couldn't. The most powerful gods of the ancient world, rulers of heaven, judges of kings, went silent the moment their temples fell and their statues were dragged away in the dark. No thunder, no rescue, just empty sanctuaries and a terrifying question echoing through Mesopotamia. If a god can be stolen, fed, and forgotten, was he ever free? Each morning, in the great temples of Sumer and Akkad, priests carried out what the tablets call the aspi, the washing of the mouth, a ritual that cleansed and activated the divine statue before offerings were presented. Bread, beer, roasted meat, sesame oil. The god did not simply receive these things as tribute. According to the ritual texts themselves, the god required them to be present. This is not a minor theological footnote. It is the central fact of Mesopotamian religion, and it changes what it means to say the gods ruled the earth. The Anunnaki, the great divine assembly whose name appears across thousands of years of Sumerian, Akkadian and Babylonian inscription, were never described in authentic texts as beings free to move between worlds at will. The records show them anchored to cities, to statues, to the unbroken rhythm of daily ritual. When the ritual stopped, the divine presence did not simply weaken. According to the theology of Eridu and Uruk, it ceased. There is a quality of quiet tragedy in this, if you listen for it. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest administrative documents in human history, preserved on a prism now held in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, records a time before the Great Flood when kingship descended from heaven and kings ruled for durations that seem, to the modern eye, impossible. The 8th king of Eridu, Uba-Tutu, is recorded as reigning for 18,600 years. His predecessors ruled for tens of thousands more. The numbers have long been dismissed as mythological inflation. But something else in the list is rarely discussed. After the flood, the reigns collapse, not gradually, sharply. Kingship becomes human-scaled. What had sustained those earlier ages, whatever it was, is gone. The tablets do not explain why. They only record that it ended. The divine decrees, the Mi, as the Sumerians called them, were described in the text not as invisible laws but as physical objects, like tablets of lapis lazuli and gleaming stone carried down from heaven and held in the hands of kings. Inscriptions from Lagash describe them as radiating a presence that inspired awe. Yet the literary tradition surrounding the Mi is also a record of loss. They were stolen, contested, passed between cities, and their power described as something that could be diminished. By the time of the great empires, the Mi are less luminous in the texts, less potent. No inscription explains what happened to their brilliance. They simply grew quieter. And then there is the rebellion, the event recorded in the Atrahasis epic, inscribed on tablets dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC, which describes the lesser divine beings, the Igigi, setting down their tools and surrounding the house of Enlil in open revolt. Yes, as scholars have long read this as a labour dispute, a myth explaining the creation of humanity to ease the burden of divine work. But the text contains a detail that tends to be passed over. The Igigi did not simply refuse. They burned their tools. They destroyed the instruments of their own labour, as though those instruments had already become useless. As though the work they were created to perform had already ceased to matter. The ziggurats they left behind, the step temples at Ur, at Uruk, at Babylon, are often celebrated as monuments to divine ambition. But their inner chambers tell a different story. The sanctuary at the summit was not designed for human congregation. It was small, intimate, equipped with a bed, a table, and an offering alcove. It was a dwelling. The god did not visit the temple. The god lived there, confined to a space of mud brick and cedar wood, sustained by offerings carried up the steps each morning by hands that could not outlast the institution they served. The gilded cage was not a metaphor the ancient Mesopotamians used. It is one the archaeology reveals for us now looking back. What held the Anunnaki to the earth was not force, it was structure. the intricate, fragile, magnificent structure of the world's first cities, and like all structures, it was subject to time. To understand how completely the gods were bound, and how slowly and how irrevocably those bonds were cut, we need to begin at the beginning. In the oldest city in the world, beside the reed marshes of the ancient Persian Gulf, where the priests first pressed stylus to clay and recorded the names of the divine, the story of the gilded cage begins. In the oldest city on earth, the priests rose before dawn, not to pray, not to meditate, to work. Eridu, built at the edge of the southern marshes where the rivers met the sea, was already ancient when the first stones of the Egyptian pyramids were being cut. Its temple had been rebuilt, layer upon layer, 17 times on the same sacred ground, and each morning within its innermost sanctuary the same sequence of tasks began. The god had to be woken, washed, fed, dressed. What the priests were attending to was not a symbol. According to the theology recorded across thousands of cuneiform tablets, the god was present inside the statue, physically, specifically in that room, in that city. Remove the statue and the god was gone. Cease the ritual and the divine presence did not linger. It withdrew. This is the first thing the tablets establish, and it is worth sitting with, because it overturns almost everything the modern imagination assumes about divine power. The Anunnaki, whose name the Sumerians translated as those of princely blood, the great gods of heaven and earth, were not distant. They were not abstract. They were administered. The temple records from Uruk, dating to the late 4th millennium BC, include detailed inventories of divine provisions, quantities of bread, measures of beer, cuts of meat, allocations of linen. These are not poetic offerings. They are ration lists. The god of Uruk received daily deliveries the way a royal household received deliveries, because in every practical sense that is exactly what the temple was. The cult statue at the centre of this system was not merely a representation. Mesopotamian ritual texts describe the Mzpi ceremony, the opening of the mouth, through which the statue was animated. Once performed, the god breathed within it. Without the ceremony, the stone remained stone. The divine was not inherent in the object. It was installed, and it required ongoing maintenance to remain. Here is what that means, stated plainly. The most powerful beings in the ancient Mesopotamian cosmos could not function without human hands performing precise tasks on a precise schedule, in a precise location, every single day. The temple at Uruk was faced with limestone brought from distant quarries. Its columns were studded with mosaic cones of red, black and white. From a distance, in the right light, it would have seemed to glow. It was, there by any measure, a magnificent structure. But magnificence and freedom are not the same thing. The god inside that temple could not leave without human preparation, could not eat without human labour, could not speak without a priest to perform the ritual that opened the divine mouth. A cage does not have to be made of iron to hold something fast, and the gods of Mesopotamia, for all their cosmic authority, had been living inside theirs since the first city rose from the mud. What built that cage, and who maintained it, is a story written in grain, silver, and silence. The oldest administrative records in human history are not royal proclamations. They are not declarations of war or treaties between kings. They are grain receipts. Pressed into clay tablets at Uruk around 3100 BC, they record disbursements of barley and allocations of labour, not for a palace but for a temple. The earliest writing humanity ever produced was not poetry or law, it was temple accounting. And that fact, quiet as it seems, reveals something about the ancient world that changes the shape of everything that followed. The gods did not merely inhabit cities, they owned them. At Lagash, one of the great city-states of southern Mesopotamia, temple estates controlled a significant portion of the surrounding agricultural land. Cuneiform records from the city describe holdings of thousands of hectares, irrigated fields, orchards, fisheries, all registered under divine ownership, all administered by a priestly bureaucracy that managed crop yields, seasonal flooding, and labour quotas with meticulous precision. The god Ningirsu did not rule Lagash from a distance. His temple held the deeds. This was not unique to Lagash. At Nippur, the religious centre of Sumer, whose temple to Enlil made it the closest thing the ancient world had to a sacred capital, excavations have uncovered tens of thousands of administrative tablets detailing the economic operations of the temple complex. Loans, contracts, land transfers, labour obligations. The temple at Nippur functioned simultaneously as granary, bank and court of arbitration. Divine authority and economic authority were not separate systems. They were the same system. At Ur, the great ziggurat rose in 3-stepped tiers above a complex that included storehouses, workshops and administrative offices. The priests who served the moon god Nana were also, in practice, the managers of the city's agricultural surplus. They recorded harvests, they controlled redistribution, they determined in lean years who ate and who did not. Here is where the structure reveals its hidden fragility. Because the gods owned the land, they were also exposed to whatever the land suffered. Temple records from across Mesopotamia document years of failed harvests with the same administrative neutrality they applied to good ones. But the implications run deeper than the scribes acknowledged. When the Tigris ran low, the irrigation channels fed by its waters carried less. When the channels carried less, the fields yielded less. When the fields yielded less, the offerings diminished. And when the offerings diminished, the ritual cycle that sustained the divine presence came under strain. The gods of Mesopotamia had been given everything: cities, land, rivers, devoted hands. But the rivers did not consult the temples before they flooded. The rains did not negotiate with the priesthood before they failed. And in the silence that followed a bad harvest, when the offering bowl sat lighter than the ritual prescribed, no inscription records what the priests felt when they carried those diminished gifts to the sanctuary door. Only that they carried them anyway, and that the god bound to that place had no choice but to wait. In 1595 BC, the most powerful god in Babylon was loaded onto a wagon and driven north. No battle hymn records the moment. No lamentation tablet describes who gave the order. The Hittite army that sacked Babylon left almost no written account of what they took or why. What survives is an absence, a gap in the cultic record of Marduk, chief deity of Babylon, that historians have spent generations trying to explain. The statue was gone, and with it, according to everything Mesopotamian theology held to be true, so was the god. To understand what that meant, it helps to understand what Marduk had become. A century earlier, under the reign of Hammurabi, Babylon had risen from a minor city-state to the dominant power of Mesopotamia. Hammurabi's legal code, the stele now housed in the Louvre, carved in black diorite and standing over 2 meters tall, opens not with the king's own authority, but with a divine mandate. Marduk, Hammurabi declared, had been chosen by the great gods to bring justice to the land. The elevation of Babylon was inseparable from the elevation of its god. Political supremacy and divine supremacy were the same claim, pressed into the same stone. Which meant that when the Hittites arrived in 1595 BC and the statue of Marduk was removed from his sanctuary, they had not simply looted a temple. They had, by the logic of the age, decapitated heaven. Babylonian theological texts are explicit on this point. The god's presence resided in the statue. Without the statue in its sanctuary performing its daily rituals, the divine protection of the city was suspended. The crops still grew or failed as before. The rivers still rose. But the cosmic order that Marduk had been installed to maintain, the guarantor of justice, rainfall, kingship and fate, had been interrupted at its source. Here is what makes this more than a story about one city's misfortune. The removal of divine statues was not an accident of war. it became a deliberate instrument of it. Conquering armies across Mesopotamia understood, with complete clarity, that capturing a god statue was equivalent to capturing the god. The Assyrian royal annals record statue removals as military objectives, listed alongside the seizure of tribute and the deportation of populations. The gods were not collateral damage, they were strategic targets. This is the detail that reframes everything established so far. The cage was not only built from ritual and grain and priestly administration, it was also built from stone and cedar and gold, materials that could be lifted, carried and relocated by any army with enough wagons. The gods of Mesopotamia had been bound to their cities, but their cities could be taken, and a god in captivity, far from the temple that animated it, surrounded by the rituals of a foreign power, was not a god at all. What happened to Marduk after the wagons disappeared into the north is a question the tablets answer only partially, and the partial answer is more troubling than silence would have been. Beneath the ruins of the ancient city of Ur, archaeologists found something the texts had not prepared them for, a layer of clean, water-deposited silt, nearly 3 meters thick, sitting between two distinct periods of human habitation. Below it, one civilization. Above it, another. And between them, nothing. Just the quiet, undisturbed record of water that had risen and stayed long enough to erase everything it covered. Sir Leonard Woolley, who excavated the site in the 1920s, initially believed he had found physical evidence of the biblical flood. Later analysis complicated that conclusion. The silt layer at Ur did not match equivalent layers at Kish, or Shuruppak, or the other cities excavated across the region. The floods were not one event. They were many, recurring, local and devastating in ways that accumulated across centuries rather than arriving in a single catastrophic wave. Which means the flood was not a memory, it was a condition. The Tigris and Euphrates, unlike the more predictable Nile, flooded without reliable seasonal rhythm. Their courses shifted, their banks gave way without warning. The flat alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, the very landscape that made agriculture possible and cities inevitable, offered almost no natural elevation. A temple built of mud brick on that plain was, in geological terms, an act of extraordinary optimism. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved most completely on 12 clay tablets discovered at Nineveh and now held in the British Museum, describes the flood not as divine punishment alone but as divine regret. The gods, having sent the waters, gather above the destruction like flies over a sacrifice, hungry, diminished, uncertain. The great goddess Ninhursag weeps. Even Enlil, who ordered the flood, is confronted by the consequences he did not fully anticipate. This is the detail the myth encodes that the theological tradition rarely emphasizes. The flood did not spare the gods, it displaced them. When a temple complex was inundated, its mud brick walls dissolving, its sanctuary floors buried under silt, the divine statue, if not evacuated in time, was lost. The ritual cycle that sustained the god's presence was shattered, the priesthood scattered, and the god, by the theological logic that had governed Mesopotamian religion since Eridu, was rendered absent, not by choice, but by water. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites across the southern floodplain shows temples rebuilt directly atop their destroyed predecessors, sometimes within a single generation. The urgency embedded in that pattern is unmistakable. The city could survive without walls more easily than it could survive without its god. Restoration of the sanctuary preceded almost everything else. But here is what that urgency quietly confirms. Each time a temple was rebuilt, the god had to be reinstalled. The rituals performed anew. The divine presence interrupted by disaster had to be reconstituted by human hands, from the beginning, as though it had never been there. The gods of heaven could not outrun the rivers. They were rebuilt like everything else from the mud, and each rebuilding raised a question no inscription chose to answer directly. How many times could the cage be reconstructed before something essential within it failed to return? At some point in the 2nd millennium BC, the god Marduk was promoted, not through revelation, not through any recorded divine event, through a text, a deliberate, politically commissioned theological document that repositioned him above gods who had held their ranks for 1,000 years. The composition now known as the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes Marduk defeating the primordial chaos goddess Tiamat and fashioning the world from her body. As reward, the assembled gods grant him 50 names, each one representing an attribute previously belonging to another deity. Enlil's authority over the atmosphere, Ea's dominion over wisdom, Anu's sovereignty over heaven itself. In the span of a single text, the divine hierarchy of Mesopotamia was restructured from the top down. Hammurabi had recently unified Babylonia. Marduk was Babylon's god. The timing was not coincidental. What the Enuma Elish represents, stated plainly, is a theological revision commissioned to match a political reality. The empire had changed, so heaven was rewritten to reflect it. The older gods did not disappear from the pantheon. They were retained, carefully, but repositioned beneath the god of the ascendant city. The divine council now mirrored the imperial court, with Marduk occupying the throne that Hammurabi occupied below. This pattern did not occur once. It was a mechanism. When Assyria rose to dominance under rulers like Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century BC, the god Ashur, patron deity of the Assyrian capital, underwent a parallel elevation. Royal inscriptions from the period describe Ashur absorbing characteristics and epithets previously associated with Enlil and Marduk. Assyrian scribes, in some texts, quietly replaced Marduk's name with Ashur's in passages adapted from Babylonian originals. The words remained. The god changed. Here is what that scribal substitution reveals, and why it matters beyond questions of theology. The gods of Mesopotamia were not fixed points around which human civilization arranged itself. They were, in a precise and demonstrable sense, reflections of it, reshaped by each dominant power to authorize that power's supremacy. Heaven did not determine the order of empires. The order of empires determined heaven, which means the Anunnaki, the great divine assembly whose authority was invoked to justify every king from Sargon to Nebuchadnezzar, were never independent of the political systems they were said to govern. They rose when their cities rose. They were elevated when their patrons conquered. And the corollary of that dependence, the implication no royal inscription ever stated directly, is that they were also subject to whatever their cities were subject to. Assyria fell in 612 BC. Ashur's temples were burned. Babylon fell again, and rose again, and fell once more. Each time, the divine hierarchy above it shifted, not because the gods had moved, but because the humans who described them had. The cage, it turns out, had always been shaped from the outside, and the hand doing the shaping was never divine. When Cyrus the Great entered Babylon in 539 BC, he did not burn the temples. That detail is almost always noted as evidence of his enlightenment, his tolerance, his political genius. And it was all of those things, but it was also something else, something the celebratory inscriptions carved in his name were careful not to say directly. The temples were preserved because they were useful. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in Babylon in 1879 and now held in the British Museum, records the Persian king's claim that Marduk himself had chosen him, had searched the lands for a righteous ruler, and called Cyrus by name to restore the god's sanctuaries and return the divine statues that previous conquerors had displaced. The text is written in Babylonian cuneiform. It adopts the vocabulary, the cadence, and the theological framework of Mesopotamian royal tradition with meticulous precision. Cyrus was not Babylonian. He worshipped other gods. But he understood, with the clarity of a skilled administrator, that the temple system was the most powerful instrument of social cohesion in the ancient Near East. To dismantle it would be to inherit rubble. To restore it was to inherit loyalty. The gods were reinstated, the rituals resumed, The offerings flowed again, and on the surface nothing had changed. But here is the shift that the resumption of ritual obscured. For 3,000 years, the relationship between the Anunnaki and their cities had been reciprocal in a specific way. The god's authority legitimized the king, and the king's patronage sustained the god. The two were bound in mutual dependence, each requiring the other to function. That relationship had been the engine of Mesopotamian civilization since Eridu. Under Persian administration, that reciprocity was severed at one end. Cyrus and his successors patronized the temples, but they drew their own authority from a different source entirely. Persian imperial legitimacy did not rest on Marduk's approval. The god was maintained, generously even, but he was no longer essential to the political order above him. He had become, in the most consequential sense, decorative. The priests continued their rituals, the sanctuaries continued receiving offerings. But the decisions that shaped the world the temple stood in, taxation, territorial administration, military deployment, succession, were made in Persepolis, in a language the Babylonian priesthood did not speak, by a court that bowed to different heavens. The cage still stood. Its gold had not been stripped. Its rituals had not been forbidden. But the door, for the first time in 3,000 years, was held open by a hand that did not believe in what was kept inside. What that meant for the gods would not become visible immediately. The temples would continue for centuries more. The cuneiform scribes would press their styluses into clay and record the hymns as they always had. But something in the foundation had shifted, quietly, or irrevocably, the night the Persian army entered without resistance, and the gods, bound as they were to a system now administered by others, had no way to refuse what was coming. The last known cuneiform tablet was written sometime around 75 AD. It is an astronomical text, a record of planetary positions pressed into clay by a scribe in Babylon who almost certainly knew that almost no one left alive could read what he was writing. The tablet was not addressed to a king. It was not a temple receipt, or a hymn, or a legal contract. It was, in the most precise sense, a message with no remaining audience. We do not know the scribe's name. We do not know whether he trained an apprentice. We only know that after this tablet the record stops. 3,000 years of continuous written tradition, ending not with a declaration, not with a final hymn, not with any recorded awareness of finality, but with a notation about where the planets were on a particular evening, pressed into clay by hands that may have been the last in an unbroken lineage stretching back to Uruk. To understand what that silence meant for the gods, it is necessary to understand what writing had always meant to them. The Anunnaki were not merely worshipped through ritual, they were constituted through language. Their names, their attributes, their histories, their hierarchies, all of it existed in written form, transmitted from one generation of scribes to the next through the Adaba, the Sumerian tablet house, where students copied texts by hand until the cadence of sacred vocabulary became instinctive. The hymns to Inanna, composed by Enheduanna, history's first named author, a high priestess of Ur who wrote in the 23rd century BC, survived because scribes copied them for centuries after her death. The rituals that animated the cult statues each morning were performed from written instructions, preserved and transmitted by an institution that trained its practitioners for years before permitting them to approach the sanctuary. The gods, in a sense that was more than metaphorical, lived in the writing, and the writing was already dying long before that final tablet was pressed. The decline of cuneiform literacy did not arrive suddenly. It retreated gradually, contracting over centuries like water receding from a shoreline, so slowly that no single generation would have experienced it as catastrophe. Under Persian administration, Aramaic had become the dominant language of imperial communication across the Near East, more flexible, written on perishable materials, easier to teach and transmit. Cuneiform, with its hundreds of complex signs requiring years of dedicated stud to master, became increasingly confined to specialist temple scribes whose knowledge was inherited rather than broadly taught. by the Hellenistic period. Following Alexander's conquest of Babylon in 331 BC, Greek had layered itself over Aramaic as the prestige language of administration and intellectual life. The temple scriptoria continued, but their output narrowed. The great literary and mythological traditions were no longer being copied in the volumes that had sustained them for millennia. The scribes who remained were specialists within specialists, a contracting circle of initiated knowledge, passing text between fewer and fewer hands. Here is the detail that reframes the entire trajectory of this chapter. Scholars studying the latest cuneiform tablets have noted something in the handwriting itself. The script of the final centuries shows increasing variation, signs formed in ways that diverge from earlier standardized practice, suggesting scribes working with less regular access to training texts, or copying from memory, or making do with exemplars that were themselves already corrupted by transmission. The tradition was not only contracting, it was, in the most technical sense, degrading. The hymns that told the gods who they were being misremembered before they were forgotten, and when the last scribe set down his stylus, whether he knew it was the last time or not, the accumulated sacred knowledge of 3,000 years became inaccessible in a single generation, not destroyed, not burned, simply unreadable by a world that had moved on to other scripts, other languages, other gods. The divine voice had always required a human instrument to be heard. When the instrument disappeared, the voice did not echo. It stopped. The temples, in some places, still stood. The statues in some sanctuaries still sat in their appointed positions, but without the words that had always animated them, without the scribes who knew the sequence, the pronunciation, the precise ritual grammar that the theology required. They were at last only stone. The gods had not left. They had simply become unreadable, and somewhere in that silence, the gilded cage had finally closed around something that was no longer inside it. The gods of Mesopotamia were not defeated in any battle that history records. No inscription marks their overthrow. No conqueror claimed their temples as trophies of a theological war. The Anunnaki did not fall the way Babylon fell, suddenly to an army at the gate, in a night that scribes would later date with precision. They were displaced by something far slower and far more fundamental than conquest. They were displaced by an idea. The idea was not new when it arrived in Mesopotamia. It had been developing for centuries along the western edge of the ancient Near East, in a tradition that traced itself to a covenant between a single people and a single god, one who, unlike every deity the Sumerian scribes had ever recorded, was not tied to a city or a statue or an agricultural estate or a river system that could flood and wash the sanctuary walls away. The God of the Hebrew Scriptures moved with his people. He had no fixed address. When the Babylonians destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 586 BC and carried the population into exile, wow, the theological crisis that followed produced something unprecedented in the ancient world. A refined monotheism in which the destruction of the sacred building was not the defeat of the god, but a demonstration of his reach. He was present in Babylon. He was present in exile. He required no statue, no daily feeding ritual, no priesthood performing the precise sequence of gestures that would keep the divine presence localized and active. He was, in the language that would eventually codify this understanding, everywhere. Sit with that contrast for a moment, because it is more radical than familiarity makes it seem. The entire structure that had sustained the Anunnaki for 3,000 years, the temple economy, the cult statue, the ritual calendar, the scribal tradition that recorded the divine voice, rested on a single foundational assumption, that the gods were somewhere specific and that human institutions were required to keep them there and keep them present. Remove any part of that structure, and the divine presence weakened. This was not a theological opinion. It was, within Mesopotamian religious understanding, a practical fact demonstrated repeatedly by flood, conquest, and institutional collapse. The God emerging from the Hebrew tradition operated on the opposite assumption entirely. Presence was not maintained by ritual. It was not localized by geography. The destruction of the temple was not the end of the relationship. And this was the theological innovation that in retrospect made everything that followed possible. When Christianity spread outward from the Levant across the Roman world in the first centuries AD, it carried this portability with it and extended it further. The sacred was now interior, accessible through prayer rather than through institutional mediation, present wherever the believer stood rather than in a specific sanctuary maintained by a specialized class of trained priests. The church building mattered, but it was not the precondition of the divine. The God travelled with the worshipper. Islam, emerging in the 7th century AD across the Arabian Peninsula and expanding with extraordinary speed through the same territories where the Anunnaki had once been administered, completed the transformation. A faith requiring no clergy for its fundamental practice, no sacred statue, no institutionally maintained divine presence, only the direct relationship between the individual and a God who was, by definition, unbounded by place. Here is the implication that the timeline of these transitions makes unavoidable. Each wave of monotheistic expansion moved through regions where the older temple systems were already weakened, where Persian administration had severed the reciprocal bond between political power and divine legitimacy, where cuneiform literacy had contracted to the point of near extinction, where the priesthoods that once formed the living connective tissue of Mesopotamian religion had thinned to isolated pockets of inherited knowledge. The ground had been prepared by centuries of gradual institutional erosion. The new theology did not need to defeat the old one. It simply filled the space that the old one had already begun to vacate. The Anunnaki had always depended on their cage, the temple, the ritual, the scribe, the priest, the king who required their authority. When those elements dissolved, the gods had nothing left to inhabit. A god who requires a building to be present cannot survive the building's irrelevance. And the buildings, one by one, had been becoming irrelevant for a very long time. The ziggurat of Ur still stands. Not fully, its upper tiers are gone, its summit long since dissolved into the surrounding plain. But the base remains, rising from the southern Iraqi desert in 3 receding platforms of baked mud brick, restored in part by Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century BC, and again, incongruously, by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. It is still visible from a considerable distance, still imposing, still unmistakably the product of a civilization that believed, with complete conviction, that what it was building would last. The god it was built for has not been worshipped there for roughly 2,000 years. No inscription records the last ceremony. No tablet preserves the name of the final priest who descended those steps, extinguished the sanctuary lamp, and did not return. The abandonment of the great temple complexes of Mesopotamia was not an event. It was a process, drawn out across generations, uneven in its pace, invisible to those living through it until the moment it had already happened. That invisibility is, in its own way, the most unsettling thing the archaeology reveals. The excavations at Uruk, conducted across the 20th century and continuing into the present, have exposed layer upon layer of occupation stretching back 5,000 years. In the uppermost strata, the evidence of temple activity thins gradually rather than stopping sharply. Offerings become fewer, administrative records become sparse. The priestly quarters show signs of reduced habitation. The sacred precinct, which had once required the coordinated labour of hundreds to maintain, contracts inward, as though the institution was slowly folding into itself, conserving what it could, releasing what it could no longer sustain. There is no destruction layer at the end, no ash, no evidence of violence, just a slow, quiet diminishment, and then nothing. The statues that survived this process now stand in museums. The Louvre, the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. They're extraordinarily well preserved, alabaster eyes still inlaid, hands still folded in the gesture of eternal prayer, carved with a precision and care that speaks to the reverence of the hands that made them. They were built to house a living presence. They now stand behind climate-controlled glass, labelled with accession numbers, visited by strangers who know neither their names nor the hymns that once animated them. This is the detail that the outline of this entire story has been moving toward, and it is worth stating without elaboration. The gods did not ascend. They did not withdraw to a higher realm when the temples closed. The theology that sustained them for 3,000 years was not a theology of departure. It was a theology of presence, of localization, of dependence on continuous human maintenance. When that maintenance ended, what the theology described as divine presence simply ceased. Not because the universe changed, because the institutions that had generated and sustained that presence were gone. The Anunnaki could not leave Earth for the same reason they could never truly have ruled it independently. They were made of it, of mud brick and grain, of cuneiform and ritual, of political authority and agricultural surplus, and the unbroken transmission of sacred knowledge from one generation of trained hands to the next. They were, in the most literal sense available to history, human constructions, not in the dismissive meaning that word sometimes carries, but in its fullest and most extraordinary one. The greatest civilization the ancient world produced looked at the forces governing its existence: flood, drought, war, death, the movement of stars, and gave them names and faces and daily needs, and built them houses and fed them, and sang to them, and recorded everything. And for 3,000 years, it worked. The sky did not break when it ended. No chariot descended. No threshold opened in the air above the abandoned sanctuaries. The last priest whispered the final hymn into a silence that did not answer. The offering bowls grew cold. The doors, at last, were left open, and the wind moved through the empty rooms the way wind moves through any empty room. The gods who had once inscribed the fate of kings into the fabric of the cosmos remained exactly where they had always been strongest. In the memory of those who still, in the quiet before sleep, find themselves listening for something they cannot name,